Well, welcome, friends. It's great to see all of you here. I'm so happy to know that there are people willing to tune in and excited to tune in to do a deep dive into one of my very, very favorite composers, Igor Stravinsky. Igor Stravinsky's unbelievable imagination is the reason we've all come here. He is absolutely one of my very favorite composers for a variety of reasons. And I hope that after I share my passion with you about him and specifically about his masterpiece, Symphony of Psalms, that you too might be intrigued to learn more, to do a little bit more listening of his music and some studying, and hopefully when the time comes, hopefully maybe sing some of his wonderful works for chorus. So my name is Rob Istad, Dr. Rob Istad, and as you can see, I do a lot of things. One of my favorite things to do, actually, is to come and visit you at Berkshire International and spend a week rehearsing and performing a great masterwork. It's one of my very favorite things to do. Not only do we get to connect artistically, but we also have the opportunity to connect interpersonally over shared meals, some wine, especially when we were in Sonoma, and our shared love of classical choral music. Now, I want to start this with a disclaimer. In no way am I an expert on Igor Stravinsky. I am not a Stravinsky scholar, everyone. In reality, my specialty area is actually the new renaissance of British choral music at the turn of the 20th century. I'm merely a professional conductor who has fallen in love with Igor Stravinsky, with who he was as a person, but most specifically, who he was as an artist, as a composer. I believe that Stravinsky truly represents a new voice, truly was what we would all call nowadays a tipping point in classical music. He was a human that could reinvent himself at the tip of a hat, and was always true to his artistic self. What I love about Stravinsky is that you can trace his growth as a composer through his maturity as a human being, but it's very special in the way that that played out. So I think, first of all, to know that Stravinsky lived in music all the time, that Stravinsky was always willing to try something new, that Stravinsky was always willing to push himself and his collaborators to dream and to try new things. This quote is one of my very favorite quotes by Stravinsky. And I love it because it talks about artistic authenticity. Yes, we know that Stravinsky had his share of problems. He was a flawed human being, just like all of us. We also know that Stravinsky had an ego, just like all of us. He enjoyed surrounding himself with the most famous artists of the day, visual artists, dance, authors, anyone you can imagine, designers, fashion designers, as we all know. But in that struggle of life, he was also true to who he was as an artist. I'd like to show you a video that it's a video of him talking about creating music and living in a life of music. And I hope that you enjoy this as much as I do.
Why should there be music? Is it possible to live without music? It isn't for you, obviously, but
it's very difficult to answer because I was always with music. And so I cannot imagine myself to be without music. Without any music, without even bad music.
Who created music?
Oh, listen, that you know, hierarchy,
Hierarchy.
hierarchy. I don't know the
It's
hierarchy.
in the hierarchy of creation.
Yeah, of the creation. It was created probably by God. And I think, I even not think, but I'm sure that when we read about the creation of the world, that it was created just a big drum and cymbals and music.
Thank you so much for suffering through the quality of that audio. You know, the wonderful thing about studying a composer from the early to and mid 20th century is that we do have video footage of him talking, and I'm going to share some more videos of him. But of course, at that time, this sort of technology was rudimentary, and they were obviously filming this in a restaurant or something outside, and and didn't clear it of people or children. But I find what he says so important, that he's never been without music. And who created music but God? God must have created music. And to Stravinsky, what did it sound like when consciousness was created? A big cymbal and a bass drum.
Why?
So today, our table of contents, this is what we're going to be talking about. And you might be saying, oh my goodness, we're not talking about Symphony of Psalms. No, we're not. We will talk about it. And my second lecture will be a really, really deep dive into the analysis of Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms, and really sort of helping you understand why I think that work is one of the greatest works of the 20th century. But to really comprehend why it's so special, I think you have to really study Stravinsky's style. You have to understand who he was as a human. You have to understand the greater sort of scope. We have to zoom out and look at his artistic career in the three style periods we now ascribe to him. And then we're going to really sort of hone in on, at the end of our time today, we're going to focus in on the second period, his neoclassic period. So Stravinsky, you know, is an immigrant. He's a musical immigrant. So he obviously was born in Russia to a musical family, and we'll talk about that. And then he moves west to obviously find great success, and specifically in Paris, in France, and then moves again, specifically to escape the horrors of World War II to the United States of America. And when he moved to America, where did he come? Where I live, in Southern California. He moved to Los Angeles. And I find that part of his history obviously very interesting, because he has a connection with my life here. He has a connection with my alma mater, with the University of Southern California, where he was a frequent visitor and collaborator with the great Ingolf Dahl, who taught at USC. Another funny little tidbit about Stravinsky's time in Los Angeles in the mid 20th century was that he lived right down the street from Arnold Schoenberg in the Hollywood Hills. If you can believe it, those two did not get along at all. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, the fact that they never interacted, even though they were practically neighbors. And even though at the end of his life, Stravinsky relinquished and started writing music very, very similar to music, or at least a system created by Mr. Schoenberg. So Stravinsky was born a very musical family. So he grew up basically in an opera house, and he loved his time in the opera house. His father is a pianist in the opera house, and so Stravinsky, sort of as a child, has access to all of the wealth of an opera house. Now, I don't know about you, but one of my very favorite things to do is to go visit friends that are professional conductors and just sort of pop in for the end of a grand rehearsal process, to go to Los Angeles Opera and to sort of watch what happens at the final chorus rehearsal and then the first orchestra rehearsal with the principals, and sort of see how that comes together. Or to go watch a friend like my friend Carl St. Clair in Orange County. I love to go and watch both his first orchestra rehearsal on a new piece and then his last orchestra rehearsal. I find that far more interesting at this point in my career and life than the actual performance, because I learned so much about how professional music is made, and really how the very finest musicians in the world hone something to such a pristine luster. So Stravinsky had all of these, this wealth of opportunity for him. He was able to go to these rehearsals and performances without asking permission. He could literally walk into their world-class library and pull out any score that he would like to take a look at. These included operas, but also ballets and instrumental works. His father was an incredible pianist, and therefore Stravinsky was able to study with his father. And I think the most important thing to notice is that his piano studies involve significant improvisation. And this is a through line to many of our world's greatest composers, those that we sort of consider the greatest composers, were also some of the greatest innovators of improvisation. And which is funny because it scares me a little bit, everybody. I am not the best improviser. I was trained as a pianist, and I really love to read, write at sight, and hone something that somebody else has written. But sitting down and improvising for me is uncomfortable because I was sort of trained as an interpreter and not as an improviser. And I think that that's what is essential to the career of a really excellent composer, this idea of improvisation. How else would they have the opportunity to dream up new sounds and new ideas? So when Stravinsky goes to university, obviously this is going to go fast today, everybody. When he goes to the university, his father and mother, his mother, the professional singer, encourages him to study law. And everybody that knows in a household of professional musicians, what do you want for your child? But something different, right? And that's true almost of every family, no matter what. I was slated personally to study medicine when I went away to college, and just like Hector Berlioz, I couldn't stay away from the music building. And look what happened to me! Oh my goodness! And just like Hector Berlioz, Stravinsky, same thing. Studies law, but he also studies music concurrently. And in those days, that was considered something very wise to do. In fact, many law schools really at that time, moving into formal law training, valued someone that had that depth and breadth of experience and the wonderful ways that music can enhance a person's not only their soul but their brain function, organization, etc. During his musical studies, he connects with composer Rimsky-Korsakov's son. He doesn't know it's his son at first. Stravinsky just strikes up a friendship and then discovers that, oh my goodness, this is the son of the very, very famous Rimsky-Korsakov. And so Stravinsky gets to meet this very famous composer. And most importantly, they hit it off. And he has the opportunity to study privately with Rimsky-Korsakov. Rimsky-Korsakov is considered one of the quintessential, obviously, Russian composers, and he is trained beautifully in orchestration, in the technique of orchestration. And to understand this, we have to talk just briefly about how this happened. You see, and I don't want to go into great detail, but politically, the Russian royal family, the czars, and this is obviously before the communist era, but the czars and the French royal family were really working hard to connect with one another. Specifically, the Russians really want to connect with the French royal family, and therefore many of the well-educated and wealthy, the elite Russians, also were trained in reading and speaking French. Now, why is this important? It's important because they could more easily access literature written in French than in German. In the late 19th century, there were two sort of orchestration books that were vying for attention. And one of them was written in French, and that was written by Hector Berlioz. We all know Hector Berlioz, who had some very interesting ideas about color and orchestration. You know, Berlioz was the innovator that sort of got everybody to step away from formal classical boxy style. Oop, there's my piano. Boxy style. And that refers to things like sonata allegro form, rondo form, all of these structures that were set up to help composers think out and work out musical problems. Berlioz said, why do we have to do that when human beings can listen to a melody, and that melody can be all the unification that a piece needs? This technique he called idée fixe, right? Or sort of the central idea of a piece. This eventually became the word which you might be familiar with, leitmotif. And leitmotif is essential to the progressive wing of German composers as well. People like Richard Wagner really grabbed a hold of Berlioz's ideas. Not only did the progressive Germans and Austrians take care to really study and embody Berlioz's ideas about unifying a piece through thematic rather than formal structure, the Russians did as well. Why is this important to our conversation? It's important because it played a significant role in Stravinsky's early development as a composer. He's studying with Rimsky-Korsakov, one of the heirs to this thematic way of thinking about musical synthesis. Rimsky-Korsakov, though, also forced his students to really delve into the old school form of counterpoint. So not only was Stravinsky receiving this beautiful education in colorful orchestration, using winds as color instruments, strings as color instruments, even choruses, he was also given the opportunity to study the ancient, they thought ancient, the old art of counterpoint, fugal structure. If you think about fugue, and we're going to talk about that a lot in the second lecture that I give you. Most importantly, Rimsky-Korsakov helped Stravinsky cultivate a sense of pride in his heritage, a sense of wonder about the development of Russian culture specifically. And when creating art, Rimsky-Korsakov encouraged Stravinsky to return to the rich heritage of folk music, story, and art as inspirations for his creations. So Stravinsky eventually has to deal with in his development a conflict. You know, building upon tradition of Rimsky-Korsakov, which was his initial education as a serious composer, and then this new world he encounters in Europe, specifically in Paris, France. This they called it the world of art, which was a bunch of younger composers, painters, authors, poets that were interested in breaking new ground. They came up with ideas like abstract expressionism. And this idea of art as a mystical experience. Now, I would posit that as choral musicians, we've always known that music is a mystical experience, primarily because the very foundation of music, the foundation of choral music, is rooted in religious practice in Western society. And I would also argue in non-Western society that singing is a deep expression of soul, a deep expression of connectivity with one another and with the divine. And you see at this time in Europe, and specifically in Paris, Kandinsky, a visual artist, and I actually really love his paintings. I don't know about you, but Kandinsky says we need to prioritize this kind of experience, this kind of mysticism, and when we're listening to music. Now, I think you can have that kind of experience listening to Mozart, listening to Haydn, listening to Bach. But I think that at this time they were looking for sort of a more overt catering to that experience. And so there are new horizons, right? The development of French Impressionism in music, French Impressionism in art and in music oftentimes are sort of lumped together. I find that they're more disparate than that, but that's another story for another day. And then, of course, the Viennese secessionists, led by painter Gustav Klimt. And they were really interested in a blending of forms. So this idea that that you could extract new art from ancient ruins, from old ways of thinking, looking to folk art as authentic representations of human expression, and that folk art isn't tainted by a formal education. This is what they're thinking. Well, these are all formally educated humans now looking and saying, wait. You know, we've been taught this way of thinking. We've been taught to compartmentalize our art. And if we just look back to folk art, to people that weren't forced into this respect for systems and processes, that this was more expressive of authentic humanity. I think that in this entire series of the slide, the most important thing that Stravinsky took from all of this, obviously, was his introduction to Empresario Diagolev, which is a very famous name. And we know that Diaghilev cultivated Stravinsky's early career and remained a trusted friend and confidant even into his second period of work. Diaghilev connected Stravinsky to the choreographer Nijinsky. He connected Stravinsky to Pablo Picasso. He really provided a foray for Stravinsky's artistic expression into the height of fame and fortune. So the evolution of Stravinsky's genius, I write, is taken in 3 style periods. Now, this is what we teach all of our students in music history class, the 3 style periods of Stravinsky. I would posit that Stravinsky was a genius even as a child, and I think you might agree with me. So his creative evolution, we generally put into 3 baskets, three different periods. One is the modernist period. When I was in school, we called it his Russian nationalist period. And now scholars looking back say we need to look at this more like his modernist period. And modernist, that means connecting to the views of the secessionists, the impressionists, the people that are interested in folk art, the people that were interested in that new art that we were just discussing. The neoclassic period feels like an abrupt shift. But I look at it as a riff on the modernist period. I look at it as Stravinsky's response to his formal music education as a composer, and finding and reconnecting with the gems that he was taught by studying all of that historic music. You might be saying, what does neoclassic mean with regard to music? We'll talk about that, I promise. And then the third period was his serial period. And I write not connected to Schoenberg, rather it's an extension of his expressive development. Modernist combined with the systematic neoclassic and the creativity of reinterpreting that music culminates in his serial period. So here's sort of a timeline, just so that you understand where we're focusing our time. So in 1907 is when Firebird really takes off. That's when he's starting to write Firebird. So we call that his modernist period. Before that, he was developing as a composer. 1920 is thanks to Diaghilev and a little bit of pushing, Stravinsky becomes fascinated with the music of the past. And so that instigates his neoclassic period. You can see that the icon I've used for 1907 is supposed to be somebody dancing, because I want you to think about that really as the centerpiece of his ballet. That's really where his work with dance is most centered. 1920, obviously there are some works in the neoclassic period centered on dance, but he moves into opera in 1920 and also strict instrumental music. As part of that neoclassic period is 1931's Symphony of Psalms, in between the two wars. And that's the piece that we are going to be focusing most of our energy on in this series. Finally, we'll talk briefly about his serial period. This is something that I find really fascinating as a student of modern music, and I find that his serial period really is some of the most artistically inspired serial music. I find that Stravinsky moves from systems of mathematic structure in music and creates something really beautiful, really moving in that venue. The first period we'll talk about today is the modernist period. So Diaghilev has established a company in Paris called the Ballet Russe, and it's the Russian ballet in Paris. And you see that at this time, the French public themselves have a real passion for Russian ballet, obviously, primarily stoked by the great Tchaikovsky. And so Diaghilev sees an opportunity. You know, he's an impresario and / entrepreneur, and he sees a real opportunity to give the French people a real introduction and deep dive into their passion for Russian ballet. But he wants to give them something new. And so he connects new artists together to create new works that he often pairs with some of the older classic beloved works written by composers like Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky. So there's a direct connection to Russian culture and everything that Diaghilev really wants to produce as a producer impresario. For Stravinsky, this means that this will be modeled on the example set forth by Rimsky-Korsakov. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the ballet Firebird. So first of all, here are some characteristics about Firebird, remembering that this is his really first big success. And we're going to talk a little bit about his development away from this sort of traditional approach. But Firebird is really a traditionally Russian nationalist piece of music. So the action on the stage of the dancers relate directly to the music. So it's all connected. There is nothing really avant-garde about the way that the music functions with regard to the story. The action is number one. The action on the scale is the heaviest, and the music serves the action and the story. Stravinsky later in life confessed to using leitmotifs or idées fixes in this piece. Again, sort of drawing a strong connection to the tradition of Berlioz and his teacher. Also, good and evil in this case are fairly obvious. The good character is characterized by diatonic, beautiful music, and evil is sort of indicated by harsh chromaticism and dissonance. He also had verbatim used folk songs from Rimsky-Korsakov's Big Book of 100 Russian folk songs as a foundation for this piece. So one of my favorite versions of this is the version that I heard at Walt Disney Concert Hall, conducted by Esa-Pekka Salonen. But that is not on YouTube. And so we are going to get to watch a little bit of Firebird by Igor Stravinsky. And so I am going to give us a few minutes to listen to this so that you can catch a little bit of the flavor if you don't know a lot about the Firebird. Isn't that fantastic, everybody? I find the Disney imagination really great. Now, of course, it has not a lot to do with the actual Firebird legend and fairy tale. I'll leave that to you to look up, and the actual subject matter the of the wonderful ballet story. So this is one of my very favorite quotes about Firebird. So there was a French music critic, Bruxelles, that was invited to a preview by Diaghilev of this brand new piece of music before the orchestra was even brought in. He just got to watch some of the rehearsal with the dancers, and Stravinsky sat down at the piano to play. And I love that it says, this composer, young, slim, and uncommunicative, with vague, meditative eyes and lips set firm in an energetic-looking face, was at the piano. And then, just like so many incredible artists, when he gave himself over to music, the critic was totally taken with the piece. So Stravinsky becomes quite successful after this. And it gives birth to the next big ballet, Petrushka, which is a story about these puppets in a town square. And I'll leave that to you to look at. Of course, we can't talk about Stravinsky without discussing Rite of Spring. And I think he was happy to be fairly famous / infamous for this piece of music. And I think also it's a disservice to his entire output to focus completely on Rite of Spring. I think many music history courses, especially intro to music history at universities for our non-music majors, we say Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, okay, moving on. And I think that does a disservice to who he was as an artist and what a game changer he was. But we must talk about it because it's a very important piece of music. This has connections with that new world of art, that connection with folk culture, folk artist. He collaborated with a primitivist artist, Rösch, which is funny. He has a Russian name, a French name, a German name, and different pronunciation through each. But I use Stravinsky's pronunciation. He always called him Röhrisch when he talked about him. And this was an artist who was really inspired and got himself involved going to actually archaeological excavations in Russia, and was really sort of informed about pre-literate theater. Theater that wasn't written down, but that there is a historical record of how theater worked before people were readers. And Stravinsky was really captivated by his imagination. And so they collaborate to create this piece, this specific ballet. And there's really not a big plot. The plot really equals the power of spring, as I write. So there are 3 parts of the story. One is this big celebration. Now, I live in Los Angeles, and so spring is not a big deal here, but I grew up in the cornfields of northern Illinois, and I'm sure many of you are in parts of the world that actually experience seasons. And if you live in a place that experiences a really devastating winter, such as those northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin winters, there is a profound joy and excitement when spring finally arrives, isn't there? And so that's what this piece is about. It's about this unbridled joy, but also a primitive culture trying to sort of appease an angry God that would sort of visit this terrible winter, this terrible trial upon humankind, and sort of try to appease God to keep it from happening again. So that's part of the situation. So the first part of the story is there's a big celebration of spring. And then the second part is there's a blessing by the elderly wise man, the person that has been through a number of terrible winters. And then finally, and most controversial probably, is that there's a big, huge dance in the third part. And one of the virgins that's dancing dances herself to death, the sacrifice of the virgin. Of course, this piece was incredibly controversial. Mostly, people say there's arguments for the choreography, which was highly stylized. Nijinsky did a bunch of very highly stylized sort of stomping motions, trying to make it really primitive. Also, Stravinsky's music changed here. The musical language becomes very abrupt, abrasive, Very, very caustic. And we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of innovations that Stravinsky employed in this piece. But what you should know is there's a legend that there was a riot at the premiere performance. And what actually did happen was, yes, there were problems in the audience with those that attended the first performance of Rite of Spring. And to this day, there's been a bit of a controversy of how significant this was and whether Stravinsky sort of opportunistically told tall tales. But I think more than likely something did happen in the audience. And I have a video here of wonderful dancer who was a part of that production, and Stravinsky himself talking about the fateful premiere of Rite of Spring, a moment that would live on in infamy and would help make Stravinsky an international celebrity.
Diaghilev encouraged me to use a huge orchestra. I am not sure my orchestra would have been as large otherwise, but this did allow me to build chords and harmonies much richer and more complex than ever before. Above all, however, it was the rhythm that was shocking. I used no regular meters. I was interested in constructing phrases of different lengths and in a totally new language of rhythm. So new, in fact, that the sacrificial dance at the end, in which a chosen virgin dances herself to death, I could play, but I did not at first know how to write. The ballet was performed at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, which I revisited some 52 years later.
Your parents were not born when I knew this theater. In 13, they played a work which you know by name, the Sacre du Printemps. It was the biggest scandal in the last 50 years, you know, in the theater. I was sitting there, and the scandal started here. But when the curtain came up and I saw what Nijinsky did as choreography, it started to be tremendous, you know, the noise. And Nijinsky was there, on such a chair, just standing, you know, and conducting under the corps de ballet, say 7, 8, 9.
Nijinsky sat on a high chair in the wings, but visible to us, trying to keep us in time. And I was in the ensemble to help them. Somebody from the gallery shouted, "Un docteur," because she was so ill. Somebody else said, "Un dentiste," because then somebody else shouted, "Deux dentistes." Dreadful. We had been told to go on dancing, and it was a dreadful failure. However, we came to the end, and Nijinsky jumped down, and the curtain was already down, and the dura publica means the idiot public.
It was full of very noisy public. I went out, I said, "Go to hell. Excuse me, Monsieur Hidin."
They came for Scheherazade or for Cleopatra, and they saw the Sacre du Printemps. They were very shocked. They were very naive and stupid people. It has nothing to do with the art.
Different.
Sorry about that transition there, everybody. So I find that really interesting. The beginning of Rite of Spring, interesting in that people were really upset about this. And if you listen to what Stravinsky just said, he could play the rhythms he wanted to write on the piano, but he did not know how to write them down yet. the score is very complicated. It's still a feat for a great orchestra to play this piece, to play it well, and for a great conductor to conduct it well. I thought maybe we could listen to just a little bit of it at the opening. Stravinsky right away sets the tone by telling everyone this is going to be something different. He scores the bassoon higher as a bassoon solo, way at the top of its registration. It's a very complicated excerpt. In fact, when many of my colleagues in the bassoon sections of our professional symphony orchestras are auditioning, this is one of the excerpts that they must play, and they must play artistically. It's full of polyrhythms, and so that means two rhythms going on at the same time, two different keys going on at the same time. Octatonic scales. Octatonic scales are scales that move whole, half step, alternating. I'll play it again for you since I made a mistake. Interesting. It's a scale that can't live in the true overtone series, like one of the church modes of the Gregorian era. So I thought we could just listen to a little bit. I have the score for those of you that love to read music, and so that you can follow along a bit with the opening of Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of Spring. right, everybody. There we go. Interesting, and I think you can hear the innovations of that score. And if you compare that to what we just listened to in Firebird, it's like a completely different world, isn't it? Oh my goodness. And yet it's still connected. It's still connected to Russian folk heritage. It's still connected to a sense of who Stravinsky is as an expert orchestrator. You can hear the creativity and the way he's using the instruments together. It's not a typically sounding ballet score. Here are some interesting quotes. Hopefully you're having time to read those while I'm talking about this. One of my favorites is the Pierre Boulez, famous composer conductor Pierre Boulez. The ritual of pagan Russia attains a dimension quite beyond its point of departure. It has become the ritual and the myth of modern music. So this piece itself served as a real tipping point, served as an inspiration, obviously a point of departure, and something that we're still talking about today. It's something that still fascinates young students of music as they first encounter it and discover its wonders. The last piece I want to talk about with regard to his modernist period is a very famous piece called Lenos, and it's a piece of choral music for all of us choral lovers, The Wedding. Lenos just means the wedding. And it was written in 1921, 10 years before Symphony of Psalms. It's about a Russian village wedding. And Stravinsky himself wrote the libretto. And you have to imagine that the libretto really is a very sort of avant-garde style of storytelling. I find it very related to James Joyce's famous novel Ulysses, in which to really grasp Ulysses, you have to put yourself sort of in the shoes of the main character as you're sort of standing in a town square and hearing all of these different sort of unrelated conversations coming toward you at one time. It's the same thing with Stravinsky. Lenos imagines 4 different tableaus, 4 different scenes from a typical peasant Russian wedding, very old school folk wedding. And if you were standing in the midst of that experience in each tableau, the sorts of random conversations you might eavesdrop upon, you might hear around you. So where there's the departure of the bride, the departure of the groom from the parents, the actual wedding celebration, wedding, and then the celebration and wedding night. So there is sort of a timeline as part of the piece, but when you're in the midst of each tableau, it feels, again, very much like you might be a bystander or an eavesdropper. It's actually based on Russian chant and folk material. You can hear them in the piece, although I think you have to study it quite a bit, especially if you're not a student of Russian folk music. The orchestration he wrestled with. In fact, he started writing a big, huge full score, just like Rite of Spring, and then he threw it away, threw it in the trash. And in typical Stravinsky fashion, just said, I want something more creative, more interesting. He wanted to explore his sense of what the feeling of a Russian folk wedding was deep in your soul. And he finds that it's very percussive and very vocal. Percussive and vocal. And so he writes the score for 4 pianos, full battery of percussion, chorus, and SATB soloists. The soloists themselves take on different roles. Sometimes the mother of the bride, sometimes a friend, sometimes the bride herself. Likewise, the father of the bride, a loony uncle, and the groom. Sorry, the father of the groom or the bride. Lenos is sort of like the end. We look at Lenos as sort of the end of that modernist period, as though it's sort of a summation of all of these styles. You can hear the primitive styles of Lenos sort of coupled with those early styles of Firebird and Petrushka. I thought you could watch a little bit of this scene from Lenos, which I think you'll enjoy. I've performed this, in fact, right before the pandemic was set to we were set to perform this at the university where I teach. We were going to mount a full production of Lenos. I was in my last week of rehearsals with the students on this, so it was rather heartbreaking. But it's fun to relive it here with you, and we'll definitely program it again. This features a recreation of Nijinsky's very, very modern combo of folk and primitive choreography and modern choreography as well. For Stravinsky's Lenos, enjoy just a few moments. Hopefully you could hear the chant. Da 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 da. That's an actual chant lifted from Russian Orthodox tradition, put together with this little folk song. Da 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 dum ba da da dum da 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 dum ba da 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 dum, and then all of the other things sort of layered in the middle, almost like a collage, almost like a really sort of interesting cacophonous collage, and definitely sounds like a wild wedding to me, everybody. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a wild wedding to me. We're going to talk just briefly about his neoclassic period because we'll delve into this more in the next lecture. Diagolev, remember our impresario, the producer, came to Stravinsky and said, hey, let's try. It wasn't just Stravinsky, the other composers that worked for him in his Russian ballet in Paris, and said, hey, let's reimagine some of the works of the past. Wouldn't that be fun to sort of go back and sort of take those works apart and put them together in a new way? And Stravinsky at first was a little resistant to this because he was really interested in new ideas. But it eventually proved to be a new beginning for him, a new connection to him and to his Russian culture. And his not just his Russian culture, excuse me, but his traditional education and what he studied, in addition to his improvisation, all of those classical formal structure and conventions that he studied. This is a wonderful quote. It was a backward look, of course, the first of many love affairs in that direction, but it was a look in the mirror too, because we are a summation of our experience. We are a descendant of those that came before us as artists. And this was a real epiphany. I think one of the pieces that I think really points this out the most is Pulcinella Suite Pulcinella Suite was a reworking of a bunch of works of the composer Pergolesi, the Italian composer Pergolesi. And many of us singers are very familiar with Pergolesi's works because of their inclusion in the wonderful 24 Italian Art Songs and Arias book that's been published for, feels like eons, but not really. And one of my very favorite songs is Se tu mami, se tu sospiri. You know, it's just such a beautiful tune. It's just a haunting tune. And this particular ballet, Pulcinella, featured obviously a reorchestration of many of these works, as well as soloists, SATB soloists. And this is, I think you will really find interesting, this is a beautiful reimagining of that art song that you probably know and many of you have sung, Se tu mami, Pergolesi, by way of Stravinsky. Isn't that just fabulous? Just beautiful. The haunting additional melodic motifs that Stravinsky puts in, the beautiful way that he orchestrates the piece in the low strings and adding bassoon to the sound, suspensions in the middle, and his own rhythmic ideas. You still know it's Stravinsky. You can hear the pizzicati and the low bass working together to propel the music forward. In the neoclassic period, we have the wonderful woodwind octet, our Symphony of Psalms, which we'll talk about a lot more during our next lesson, Dumbarton Noakes, and the opera, The Rake's Progress. The final period that Stravinsky experienced in his life was the serial period, which was really an extension of his own beliefs and artistic language. Like all things Stravinsky, it's rooted in his sense of artistic mission. He's not doing it just to write 12-tone music, although I imagine a part of him wanted to write serial 12-tone music better than his competitor, Arnold Schoenberg, the person he really loathed. And in reality, it wed his skill in really beautiful orchestration with organization, serial organization. So if you know anything about serial music, and I don't want to give an entire lesson on serialism right now, it's the ordering of 12 tones of the scale and figuring out all the different ways those 12 tones can be used in a row without repetition, and literally exhausting that 12-tone set of notes by the end of a piece of music. You can do it by playing segments forwards, backwards, inverted, upside down, all sorts of different things. And it was really done very mathematically using a series of graphs. Stravinsky's, I think one of his most artistic points of realizing serial music was his piece in honor of poet Dylan Thomas. It's called In Memoriam Dylan Thomas. And I'm going to play just a little bit of it for you, just a short excerpt. features actually my former voice teacher, Jonathan Mack, wonderful tenor in Los Angeles here. And he is singing this wonderful piece of music in memoriam Dylan Thomas, one of Stravinsky's most artistic forays into 12-tone serial music.
Gentle into that good night, all it should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
So there's just about 2 minutes of that beautiful piece. You might be interested if you really love it and into maybe visiting more of it. Those were two dirge canons that you heard at the beginning. Stravinsky called them dirge canons. And I think you could hear that one started and then the other sort of followed along, almost as a ceremonial gesture. And then that beautiful floating tenor line, that tenor motive. It's just so stunning. So we return finally to Symphony of Psalms and why it's so important. You know, I think it was important to Stravinsky because he needed a cleansing of the slate, of the palette, following his foray into modernism. And I think he was looking for inspiration. And he found inspiration by returning to his roots. Not only is this piece important for musical reasons, it's important because it represents his reconversion to the Russian Orthodox Church. Stravinsky became very religious right around this period of time. This was commissioned by the Boston Symphony Orchestra and Koussevitzky in honor of its 50th concert season. An incredible amount of important pieces were commissioned for this specific concert season. And we'll talk more about that next time. But Symphony of Psalms is spectacular because it's a brand new formal structure. He comes with a brand new way of organizing music and a completely unique orchestration. Imagine that, the man that went from Firebird to Rite of Spring, Lenos with the pianos and the percussion, and now something completely different. And I want you to know that Boston Symphony did not get what they ordered with this piece of music. It was something unexpected, something transcendent, something a bit frustrating for the administration and the fundraisers at the Boston Symphony, but something that Koussevitzky really, really, I think, adored in the end, and has become and is considered one of the greatest pieces of music written in the 20th century. So I invite you to stay tuned. I thank you for your beautiful attention to this storytelling session about one of my favorite composers, Igor Stravinsky. I hope you have an appreciation for who he was as an artist. And maybe now you have sort of a perspective where he came from, where he was when he wrote Symphony of Psalms, and where he's headed afterwards. All of it to the heart center is about authenticity, about being yourself, and about being connected to a greater sense of artistic purpose in our shared human experience. I'll see you next time where we delve into Symphony of Psalms. I know that my friends at BCI have given you opportunities to look at different scores of the piece, and so hopefully, if you wanted to have a score of the piece of music, you have it for yourself for next time. I also provided a link to them to Leonard Bernstein's marked performance score of Symphony of Psalms, which I find really interesting. And you could sort of download that on your tablet and have that ready to go if you'd like to follow along with me on that. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you're liking Stravinsky more than you did, or if you did like Stravinsky, maybe you're loving him more than you already knew you could. I'll see you next time where we really delve into that gorgeous masterpiece, Symphony of Psalms. Bye-bye.